Okay, so yesterday we saw the importance of Peter's understanding of the church as elect exiles and focused on that word elect. And chapter 1 ended with Peter emphasizing the importance of God's living and abiding word in birthing and nurturing God's elect people. And he continues with this theme at the start of chapter 2, calling believers to long for pure spiritual milk, or the sincere milk of the word. So we grow as followers of Jesus when we desire God's word and when it's fed to us sincerely, without impurities or additives. This is how we taste the goodness of the Lord mentioned in verse 3. And then next, in verses 4 to 10, Peter shares about the identity and purpose of the church as God's chosen people, using images from construction. And first he describes Jesus as the living stone. And the word for stone used here means one that's been shaped for a specific use. So just as you can't build a strong construction on a wonky pebble, you can't build the church on anything other than Jesus. He's been shaped for just this task. And Peter adds the word living. The church isn't simply built on the ideas, reputation, or example of Jesus, but upon the living stone himself. And perhaps the reason Peter urges this so strongly is because this living stone isn't always accepted. In fact, he's often rejected by people. And Peter shows this by quoting from Isaiah and Psalm 118. And of course today many continue to reject Jesus and try to build their lives upon other foundations. So Peter's saying, don't be fooled, church. Don't be led away from Christ and the gospel message. You'll only trip and stumble. Instead, come to Christ, the living stone, and like living stones, be built into a spiritual house, or indeed a temple, it says in verse 5. But more than that, in verse 9 he adds, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. And all of these descriptions come from the Old Testament, but once again Peter applies them to the church. Now just a quick word on the phrase chosen race. Misunderstood, such language could create attitudes of superiority or even bigotry. But of course the whole point about Christ's church is that it's for those from all nations and tribes and tongues. And in the church there is no room for racism or superiority. It's by God's utter grace, isn't it, that we've been chosen to form his new people. And finally, Peter describes the new purpose of God's chosen people, and that is to proclaim God's excellencies, it says in verse 10, to a world that needs to hear. So that's all still been very much focused on the elect part of how Peter describes the church. Then from verse 11 onwards, Peter picks up what it means to be exiles. And in verses 11 to 12, he offers this simple strategy for living as exiles in the world. Firstly, turn from sin or passions of the flesh, then live good, honourable lives, and then anticipate God's transformation. And Peter takes that strategy and applies it to several situations involving believers in positions of powerlessness. And we deal with two of these today. First, how are believers to live in relation to secular authorities, especially when maligned or abused? And Peter's advice is, be subject to them. You know, most of the time authorities enact laws to restrain sin and encourage goodness. Not always, but most of the time. So follow those laws. Don't make life harder for yourselves than it already is. But Peter adds something a little more radical here too in verse 16. Live as people who are free, he says, as servants of God. So remember who you ultimately serve and who holds the ultimate power, not governors or politicians, but God. So honour everyone, including those in secular power, but fear God alone. And if that means standing against those in power who oppose God and his ways, so be it. And then in verses 18 to 25, there's a long section addressing servants or household slaves. Now, even if what's meant here by slavery is very different from the transatlantic slave trade that we know about, it still wasn't great. And it would have been nice if Peter had said that, but he doesn't. A, because it just wasn't on his radar, but also B, because to encourage an uprising, it would have been suicidal for those servants and lost many of them their employment and security. So what Peter calls for here is not some wild revolution, but something even more radical. Faithful endurance in the face of struggle and injustice. And all who follow Jesus need to learn how to do that. We'll all face tough situations where we need to keep going and keep doing the right thing. And this is what Peter encourages here. This is how you live well as exiles in a world that will often give you a hard time. Keep faithfully enduring by leaning deeply into Jesus, the one who suffered for you and the one who is the true shepherd and master of your souls. So lots to think about again today, but I hope that has been helpful for you.